Oh, Zasis here. I'm having a real hard time putting together this particular video, so I'm just going to do the stream of consciousness thing here, just go through the patch notes, because otherwise it's going to take like 2 weeks for me to get this video out, and I don't want to spend that long on this. Um, that would be kind of pointless. Uh, so it, it's a day later, so at this point we know that the reception to this patch is pretty negative. The people in general have a negativity bias, so that kind of makes sense. It also doesn't help that there's only nerfs in this patch, so if someone was unaffected by it, they are probably ambivalent, and people that are affected by it are really negative about it. So, yeah. Personally, I think that most of the changes here are probably necessary and healthier for the game. I, there's a couple things that maybe went a little too far, but we'll go over that when we get to them. Let's start. The new features, always on social outposts. These points here are all just edge cases that could come up that would be a problem with always on outposts. It seems like they've considered most, if not everything. Um, so we're probably fine with this. I think this is a very good thing. It allows for a lot more communication of the communication of outposts. Like I can be like, hey, I found this really cool outpost inactive, and you can actually play it instead of waiting, 2 weeks and seeing if the person put it up on social. Daily challenges, I think, is a little bit more lukewarm. It is more interesting to shake up your gameplay using daily challenges. Like if you don't normally use a defensive weapon, having a defensive weapon challenge. Although there is like a refresh button, so you can avoid those if you don't like it. But it is better than just GenMat. It's also much better communicated, but it also gives, roughly the same reward, but it doesn't have the tribute level that can be done constantly. So there's that, which I think is a little silly because it does mean that if you're playing a lot, you're actually getting less resources because of this system. It's not really a big deal because it front loads it a little bit so that you're getting slightly more initially and less over high amounts of time, probably better in the long run. I just think it's a little. It's not strictly positive, not a strictly positive update. The five mods and augments, these are all pretty good. Or like not necessarily strong. Like they're not, except maybe pulverize. Pulverize is very strong. Um, they're just like they have some use cases. Like most mods, they have some use cases. You put them on some, you don't put them on others. It'll be fine, and it'll make for some interesting decisions. The pulverize mod is probably the most worrisome, increasing the piston speed. It basically doubles the speed of the piston. As an FYI, I have already determined ways to get around this with both in situations like the piston corridors with incinerators at the end, which are really difficult to deal with melee. Even with the pulverized mod, I can still get through those with uh, dual sword, sledge shield, and Fury's edge shield, which I don't even think is a particularly good loadout. But it's more difficult, obviously, because we've added something that makes it more difficult. But um, it's still doable, even with the loadouts that are the worst at handling that particular situation. So that was probably my main concern about this, that you could completely turn off melee players, but that's not actually the case. So that's good. Decals, free decals. Can't complain about free decals. Anything that shakes up the visual look of the game is great because not all builders will use it, but some will, and when they do, it'll feel more unique, even if it's not, even if the actual internals aren't that different. It's like when you're, say, playing Destiny and you go to a new planet. It doesn't matter that the game's the same and it's the same enemies most of the time, or enemies you've probably fought before. The Just the change of color palette does make it feel new. Um, quality of life. Most of the quality of life updates are just trying to bring console more in line with PC. I hear there's an issue with Unreal 5.1, specifically on PS5, that causes the decals to be really low res. Hopefully that'll get fixed in the hotfix, but we're not 100% sure if that's going to be in the hotfix or if it'll have to come out down the line. It's a little unfortunate, but the rest of these are pretty good. Field of view, replay, being able to move around replays, directional lighting, all things that I think they're just like these are all more besides like the glitch with the Unreal 5.1 and the decal stuff. These are all pretty much strictly positive. And I don't even know if this is if this glitch with Unreal 5.1 is actually behavior's fault or if it's actually just a problem in the Unreal Engine 5.1, which could very much be the case. It could go either way. I would need to see other games in Unreal 5.1, and most games don't advertise what engine they're on. As for other positives, a lot of these bug fixes, there's a lot of bug fixes in here, and a lot of these bug fixes are strictly positive. Anything that, like, all these co-op ones are just like preventing things that should work. There's some hardware that was disappearing, projectiles bouncing off things that shouldn't have, cannon backs not activating when they should have, Sentry Beam not activating when it should have. This is just an animation not playing. It didn't actually have a gameplay impact, but it looks slightly nicer now when playing dual sword. The chain being unbreakable on the Iron Claws sometimes. I didn't even know that was possible before, but apparently there was a glitch that caused it. And being able to like peek into blocks. All things that you don't really want to be able to do. Well, maybe peek into blocks you could use, but ideally you wouldn't be able to do any of these. This one here we'll come back to. This one here, they finally fixed the guard recording. It's not triggering a difficulty rating thing. This doesn't. This was one of the first videos I ever put up on my YouTube channel. For Meet Your Maker. Obviously, there's stuff before this, and it's been the case since pretty much release. I think actually probably the open beta, but you could put a guard pathing down. It technically should adjust the difficulty rating, but it wouldn't, and then you would go and adjust something else or leave the map, and your difficulty would increase. It made it really unclear how the difficulty rating worked. The next two are just edge cases that are where the difficulty rating wasn't increasing as much as it should. We'll come back to those though. You couldn't see all the skulls when you set it to all. That was silly. It does cap at 200 still, so you don't get to see all of them, all the skulls if you have too many. But you used to be seeing like 130 something normally when there should have been 200, which was silly because it could only load 200 skulls at a time. There was an update. There was a loadout issue, and there was some performance issues if you tried to strip a really large outpost. Like these are all pretty good. Holocubes not showing in thumbnails, like great. Directional thumbnails are no longer really dark, great. Some issues with replays, with free cam and moving it backward and forward. So yeah, hopefully replays are just a little bit more stable. Great, can't complain. I love watching replays, and they are very glitchy if you're not just watching them straight. There's just a bunch of UI stuff, mostly related to some of its ranking points, where you were seeing like the total number of ranking points you'd ever earn instead of the change, but a lot of it's just with the item notifications and how the cosmetic stuff was displaying, and some title crashes. Just fixing some crashes. All those are good, right? Anything there was good. I can't complain about. I don't think anyone would complain about anything that I've just mentioned. There are some changes because there's only nerfs in this in the balance changes, and some of the bug fixes would technically be considered nerfs as well. There there are some things that people have concerns about. So let's start with the balance changes. Where's balance changes? Here. Uh, so Plasma Sentinels, their Plasma Cloud got nerfed again. It's now 4 meter diameter with a duration of 3 seconds. Plasma Sentinels are the trap that probably gets the most complaints about it. It's the one that it was definitely overtuned initially, and mostly because Plasma Sentinels, like one or two of them, it's not great, but more of them covers their own weakness. So one of two of them's not bad, it is not great, but 50 of them is. And so that's why they're constantly seeing nerfs, and because they're constantly seeing nerfs, we're gonna keep seeing nerfs on them, and it's fine. It's fine. People have a lot of difficulty with these. It makes sense that they're probably going to get a nerf when it's a major complaint that the that they are too strong, even though I don't think that would be a consistent assessment across all player skills. Uh, for There's also some trap capacity stuff here. The Sentry Beam mods are being increased from 5 to 15, Self-Destruct mod from 10 to 15, Catch and Release from 5 to 10. This has been a really big point of contention because because a lot of people that build brutal maps push their capacity to the absolute limit, and by pushing their capacity to the absolute limit, even small changes like this will push you in over the edge, and then your map is no longer valid. These balance changes have to happen at some point, I feel. Like, you can't just not touch the cost of things. It is a lever that you need to be able to adjust. And the last time we had this adjusted was 7 weeks ago. And maybe that's too soon. Maybe they shouldn't be touching trap capacity in the mid sectors, and it should only be sector updates that ever touch trap capacity or something. That's that that could be something to consider. We'll see how behavior goes forward, but every one of these changes here makes sense. To start with, 5 trap capacity, aside from the Sentry Beam mobs and Catch and Release, which both have been adjusted here, is normally only for second wave. And second wave, it is suspect whether it's even worth the mod slot, let alone the 5 capacity. So 5 capacity is like, this mod is not good. Like, this is not, like, you really going to need to think about putting this on here, because it is probably harmful. And Catch and Release, I feel like on paper feels like that, but isn't. The Sentry Beam mobs, I just don't understand why they were ever 5. 15, I think, might be a little bit too high for some of them, but I think it makes sense for the one that causes the uh, laser to bounce higher and the one to increase the number of bounces. I think they both justify 15. It's just that last one that I cannot recall. Oh, tracking, which, if that's fixed, it's probably worth 15, but it was broken. Um, the catching will, like, they probably should have always been 15. It's the they don't feel like 5 capacity mods. That was a very big surprise when I jumped in the game the Dredgehold for the first time. And self-destruct from 10 to 15. Self-destruct on Death Pistons is the best. It's the best trap to put self-destruct on. It should be 15. It probably should be higher, but 15 is a good start. These are all very good mods that were very cheap, and they probably deserve they deserve to have their costs adjusted a little bit. You don't really want to touch their, like, how they function in most of these cases, because their function is relatively straightforward. So this is the lever that you really need to use to adjust them. And yeah, like you could easily put catch and release on most iron claws. You just put an acid below it, and you're fine most of the time. Um, and same with the Sentry Beam mods ends the struct on the Death Piston. Now, the next part, I think this is the part I think they've gone too far with. So Ravagers needed a nerf. I'm going to come out with that. They definitely needed a nerf. Anyone that says otherwise is blind. There there was a reason why every base was using Ravagers. People gravitate towards things that are overpowered, even if they wouldn't admit to it, they'll gravitate to what works. And Ravagers always worked in basically every situation. They were good at short range, they were good at long range. They locked down movements, which meant that any other trap would be able to deal with them because most traps and guards force you to move. And then Ravagers punish you for doing that. The number of times I've been watching someone run down one of their bases and they were just like, oh yeah, and this Ravager overperformed. I did it myself in Olay. There's two Ravagers standing just like outside the entrance of the base, and they got like 50% of the kills. There was two Ravagers with Bloodlust and basically nothing else, just standing out in the open, and they got like 50% of the kills. That's nothing capacity wise and incredible results. Um, they they were definitely overperforming. Um, but the the most of these I think are fully justified. So reducing the vision range from 38 to 31 meters. They used to have a vision range that was longer than any other guard in the game, which made no sense because they were shotgunner with poor vision in the lore. It's really silly, but dropping it to enforcer level, sure, whatever. That that should be fine. They've also put a max range on their projectiles so that if you're further than about 7 blocks away, you won't get hit by them. So they're not good at like infinite range anymore, but they're still good at like a short to medium range. That's fine as well. The pre-attack duration, that's the time when it's first seeing you to when it starts its actual attack pattern. Got increased from 1.5 seconds to 2 seconds, so it takes an extra half a second before they start shooting at you. If they've already aggroed on you, they would have, and they've already started shooting and you like backed out and come back into the room. This timing isn't doing anything. It's not actually affecting their like attack delay once it affects the first shot, but each subsequent shot will still be the same time from the previous shot. Uh, this is fine. It was already kind of long, and the the biggest problem with it was dealing with them if you had already triggered it. Honestly, I I don't think and if they were in bulk, this could be a really big issue. Like, if there's like four of them, and you can deal with like two of them before the attack duration, before their first attack, that's good. But you've still got two Ravagers, and they now don't have this attack duration. You have to pretty much break combat and wait like 30 seconds. Um, and having that would increasing this increases that as a counter, but that's not a good counter. And between that and the vision range, that becomes more viable to break line of sight and wait the like 10 seconds before they go back to non-aggroed. But that's kind of silly. But this last one, the attack spread pattern has been reshaped by adding a circular grouping. This is the problem. This is why I think at this point no one will say Ravagers are good. So Ravagers were too good, and now they are not good. They're obviously they need to be somewhere in the middle, and I think it's fine for them to have a circular grouping. The problem is that the circular grouping is way too tight. At the like full 7-ish blocks of range, they hit about a quarter of a block in spread, which means that you actually can't dodge their spread at all by standing in it anymore, which is silly for like a shotgun themed guard. Like That could legitimately be like 4 or 5 times as big. The spread could be like 4 times. If the spread was like 4 or 5 times bigger, and thus you could actually have like spots where you can dodge it, and it was like covering like a full block at max range, I think the circular grouping wouldn't be that bad then. And I think that the Ravager would probably actually be pretty decent. It just needs more. That circular grouping needs to be a lot. It needs to have a lot more spread on it than it currently does. It just it barely it's it's barely even a spread pattern. And yeah, because Ravagers were highly used, um, all of a sudden there's a lot of maps that people saying that aren't working anymore, and it's because they were way too reliant on the on the like one thing that we had that was actually overpowered. So that's there's some other things that are pretty close that I think could use it, but Ravagers were the worst of them. And uh, something else of note here with the balance changes, as I've mentioned before, there's no positive changes. Nothing got buffed. So things that are actually underperforming, which I think would be Hornets for guards, maybe bolt shots. Though I think that there's some other changes that might actually improve that. And Impalers are hard to say because they are I don't think a good trap. Maybe the Impaler mods is probably a better way to put it because the aside from self-destruct, Impaler mods are not great. And second wave, I guess. Second wave is pretty good on Impalers, but the default functionality is pretty good on them. Anyway, so because there's no positive changes, you can only focus on the negative, which leads to a negative feedback on the patch overall, and people get really attached to their bases, which is understandable. They spend a lot of time on them. Like it's not always quick to build a base, can be, but especially if you are putting a lot of work into it, it takes a lot of time. Some of my bases don't work anywhere near as well as they would, but most of them are just up for like the ones that I actually care about. I think are mostly unaffected, which uh, just comes down to the fact that I didn't like chasing the overpowered stuff as much as possible because I knew Ravagers were overperforming. I knew they were going to get a nerf, that they needed it. And if they weren't going to get a nerf, then the game was just going to be Ravagers, like meet your Ravagers, um, possibly forever, which uh, is kind of what we've been seeing with Plasma Sentinels, but the Plasma Sentinels are they've probably been getting to a point where we won't be seeing them as much anymore, which is unfortunate. They probably need a buff, but we'll see how that goes. I think this change may have been a little bit too much on top of the previous ones. I think if you gave them back their like kill speed, they they would probably be in a good spot, but we'll see how that goes. As for the other things that I said I'd come back to, fix an issue with Raider destroying their own grapple. Uh, this could only be done with the swords, Fury's Edge and Sledgeblade. It was easier with Fury's Edge. It was used as a movement tech because it triggered Frenzy. Uh, this needed this was definitely a bug, and there are some people that are really upset that this has happened, that they've removed a bug that increased movement. But personally, I think this needed to happen because Frenzy is supposed to be a payoff for you playing a melee playstyle, and when you include Fury's Edge to purely to deal with your to hit your own grapple, to always have Frenzy, you are getting the reward without the risk that is supposed to be involved in that. And that means that while it does mean that more people are playing Fury's Edge, it means that less people are playing melee. Um, like you are playing Fury's Edge, but you're using it purely as a defensive and frenzy trigger weapon. And so it is technically a nerf to Fury's Edge, which is not great because Fury's Edge is probably the weakest weapon in the game. But um, but it is also means that melee play styles overall have their own place now, because now melee players get to walk faster, than ranged players, because the ranged player has to become a melee player if they want to get that speed boost. And I think that is justified. I think that is a justified change because you can't make melee. Typically, the way most games work is they either make melee do more damage or they make melee do have more defense. So in most MOBA games, melee characters typically have better defenses. In Dota, most melee characters are strength based, which also increases their HP pools. Um, in the um, in the other option to increase their damage, it isn't really viable here when everything is one kill, one shot, one kill. So they need to give and the defense option isn't really viable because defense is a weapon type, and defense weapons need to be better at defense than melee weapons at all times. Like, if it's not the case, then defense weapons don't have a space. So then we start looking at what else could they do, and if you look at the Kamitachi suit, you notice that it's focused on movement speed and um, melee weapons, and that is an interesting spot for it to be in, where melee weapons get to have more mobility. Except they didn't, because you could destroy your grapple. It wasn't even like super hard. Like, people saying there was a high skill thing to do constantly, but like all you needed to do was click grapple, then immediately click your Fury's Edge. The timing wasn't that hard. Uh, this probably needed to go. Uh, the I know that people are upset that it didn't become like embraced as an unintended mechanic. There are other things that could be, and we never got confirmation that they were going to. And this isn't even like, I know there are games that do that, but they don't do that with every bug, and they don't do that, and not every game does it. Like, wave dashing isn't in Smash anymore, at least unless you're playing like an old version of Melee. Um, the they wanted, because it affected how mobility of the characters was balanced, because characters that were supposed to be slower could move faster, etc. And like, those numbers were not in control of the devs, so they got rid of it so that they could try and balance their games around other movement techniques, which failed in Brawl, but we'll ignore that one. It got better in 4 in Ultimate. Anyway, um, the other thing here that I said I'd come back to, the difficulty rating, there were glitches where Plasma Sentinels and Laser Beams were just not counting other traps that were in their activation range. Normally when you overlap activation ranges, they have put a multiplier on all the traps that overlap, and that gets really out of hand really quickly. It's was not happening with plasma sentinels and laser beams because they are well, because of a bug. Because they had non-standard activation ranges, it wasn't counting them properly, and it meant that you could stack way more plasma sentinels and laser beams into a normal and difficult outpost without triggering the increase to brutal, like really high numbers. Um, if you just use plasma sentinels, you could actually get a ludicrous number of them in normal. Um, there was also problems where traps that were being placed on the Harvey's path weren't being counted properly, and the combination of the two of these meant that a lot of maps that were rated, uh, because most people push as far as they can on the difficulty for their maps. A lot of maps have moved up at least one category, some two if they were particularly egregious with some of this, and there's a lot of complaints that of this that they built a normal base and it's no longer normal. It's like, okay, difficulty rating has changed. It is now more consistent with what the description of it has been to us. Consistency of it has always been a problem. This is fixing that. Now the 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 point at which normal and difficult bases is different than it was before. That's not necessarily a bad thing, right? The there were people building normal difficulty bases that people would actually consider brutal difficulty. Part of that was because of these glitches. These should make it more consistent. It would be nice if it was more communicated so that we could actually see, like, if we could actually see the difficulty like bar so we can actually adjust easier for it instead of, just randomly trying to work it out. But, and it's entirely possible that the difficulty rating as it stands is too low for normal and difficult. Maybe they are too much easier than they are supposed to be, but we can't know that with these bugs still in effect. These bugs need to be fixed, and then you can try and look at whether the actual numbers are right. So these bugs are fixed now, so hopefully we can see how the actual numbers shake out. And one of the main complaints that this game gets often is that the game is too hard, that there's too many impossible kill boxes, which is silly because no map is impossible, and kill box is really poorly defined, and a lot of the maps that that I've seen that people claim to be an impossible kill box are barely even like probably don't even count as a kill box in a lot of people's definitions. Um, I believe that is a relatively silent majority. I'm pretty sure that's why there's all nerfs here. A lot of these changes all make the game easier. I'm pretty sure that's probably feedback from the player survey that the game is too hard. And it's unfortunate because I'm on the other end of the spectrum, as are a lot of people who find the game just too easy. Way too easy. Um, Not mentioned in the patch notes, there is a bug. There's probably more than one bug, but there's one particularly noteworthy one at the moment, which I might just bring up the known issues board. Players are unable to load outposts equipped with Sector 0 ranking reward decals. They are planning a hotfix. Hotfixes, for those that aren't familiar with just like patch terminology, it's basically when a patch goes out and something that was really bad, um, something that's really bad would require a hotfix. That they're normally like rushed patches pretty much, so like you will put them out as soon as they're available. So a hotfix taking more than about 3 days would be weird. Um, it's so currently, if you put a Sector 0 ranking decal on a base, you won't be able to load back into it, and people won't be able to load into it to rate it. So just don't use your Sector 0 ranking rewards if for the time being. And if you have a map that you are currently unable to get into, that's probably why. And it should be fixed quickly. Uh, it is already been identified as a big issue. So just letting you know if you're not already aware, and hopefully it won't be too much longer for that one. I haven't heard of anything else that's been super problematic as far as bugs go in game, but you know, they don't always get found in the first day or two. It could be a week, it could be weeks before something particularly problematic is found. Anything else particularly problematic? It's just really unfortunate because pretty consistently had at least one. It's always been different, but there's always seems to be at least one game-breaking thing. And the problem with hotfixes, because you don't have as much time to test them, they often cause them as well. So there's a very real possibility we'll have another one after 1.4.1. But we'll see on that front. Anyway, that's it for the patch notes. Gone over everything, and I will be back on the weekends to do a guide for Fury's Edge, which will be a short one because there's not a lot you can do with Fury's Edge, but that will happen on the weekend. So see you then.